And today's topic is going to be what you don't know about Noah. And of course, we all know that story very well of Noah and the flood, all of those things. But there's a lot of things there, if you dig deeper into it, that you'll find out about. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to dig into those deep things. And we all know this story. Mankind has become so evil, except for Noah and his family. God decides to destroy mankind in a flood. And then Noah and his sons build a boat to preserve them and the animals. And then earth that existed was destroyed by water. And everything that was not on the boat, everything that breathed air, is what God says died. And so that's the basic story of Noah, and we've all seen that countless times. But we're going to dig into more details, things that you might have missed, things you didn't see, and also some New Testament references that go back to Noah and refer to Noah. And so we'll pick out quite a few things. There's a lot of slides here. We'll see if we can get through all of them this week, but maybe we won't. So first thing is Noah's name and his father's prophecy. That's kind of an interesting thing. When Noah is born, Lamech, his father, says of him, he speaks a prophecy about what Noah will be. And he says, from Genesis 5:29, he says, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." So he's saying prophetically that Noah is going to be the person who's going to give them rest from what has happened as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. And if you remember from that, God cursed the ground. You remember when he says that to Adam after the sin. And so God has cursed the ground, and Lamech says that Noah is going to be the person who is going to bring back rest from them. And Noah's name means rest. And so that's the kind of link there, and that's why he gave him that name of Noah. So we might ask the question, how did his father get this prophecy? How did he get this understanding, this belief that Noah was going to be the person who did this? And that's part of a long string of things that we see in the Old Testament that we don't know where they're coming from. The people seem to have an understanding of God's will. They understand that God likes sacrifices. They understand a lot of things like that. And so somehow Lamech here has an understanding that this is going to be the future that Noah is going to bring. He doesn't understand how it's going to be brought, but he does understand it. And so the problem, as I said, comes from Adam and Eve's sin, and I'll read that too. That's here. "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. But thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground." So life had been easy for Adam and Eve. You remember that they were basically just pick the fruit off the trees or pick it off the leaves of whatever bush was doing berries, whatever they were growing there. And they would just pick what they wanted and eat what they wanted, and that was fine. But because the ground is cursed, now the people who don't live inside of that garden where Adam and Eve lived now struggle to survive. And that's because God has cursed this ground, as you saw there. And he said, and God, right from the beginning, says, "Cursed is the ground because of you." And so they struggle, and they really do struggle there harder than we struggle with our farmers growing grain. We don't understand exactly what that was like or what that was. But there was definitely a difference there in the lives that they lived and the struggles they had trying to grow crops than we do now. So what happens after that, during the flood, and this is still continuing on with the idea of that prophecy about Noah, it says, "During the flood the ground is ripped up and the cursed is removed from the ground because the ground has all been destroyed from that." And remember, when the flood struck, there was rain that came down, but there was also water that came up. And the understanding is that really ripped up the soil and changed everything. And as a part of that, that destroyed the curse that was on the soil. It wasn't the soil anymore. So one result of that was that the ground was no longer cursed. And God later on says, "I'm not going to curse the ground like I did for you at that time. I won't do that again." And also when at the end of the flood, when they're getting off of the ark, God says to Noah that he's going to allow mankind to begin eating meat. From then on, mankind weren't supposed to be eating meat, and that's something that changes there. So Lamech's prophecy is actually fulfilled, but probably not in the way he was expecting it. And he was perhaps expecting that his life would get easier. But in fact, what happens is that all of the people are destroyed by that, and then that removes the curse from the ground.
Stan,
Mm-hmm.
in It says that Lamech had sons and daughters also, so I guess they were in the ark. So they must have died too, perished.
I would expect so. Yeah, yeah. There were a lot of people. A lot of people, like Methuselah and some like that, just died before the flood. But yeah, there had to have been a lot of people that Noah knew, and we'll actually bump into that idea here that Noah knew a lot of people who had died. He didn't live long enough to know Adam, but he knew people who knew Adam. That's how long people were living at that time. And so he knew a lot of people, or he would have known a lot of people and seen them expire in that flood.
And people lived for a shorter amount of time after the flood, too.
Yeah, remarkably shorter. I don't have a graph on that here, but I've seen a good graph. And what happens is grandchildren start dying of old age before their grandfathers die of old age. That's how quick that change is. And so people like Noah lives 900 years, and his grandsons die before he dies. And that kind of goes on for a period of time because the lifespans are becoming so much shorter so quickly. So Lamech's prophecy is fulfilled because the curse is removed from the ground, but probably not the way he thought about it. Now another thing, and this comes from the New Testament reference. I'll read from 1 Peter 2:5. It says, "And he did not spare the first world, but he preserved Noah, the eighth man, a preacher of righteousness." So what we see here is Noah's being presented by Peter as a preacher of righteousness. But in Genesis, Noah is never presented as being a preacher. And so a lot of people wonder about what is meant exactly by that. And some say, well, maybe it was just the act of building the ark that was a silent preaching or a silent testimony that Noah was giving. But other people think that, well, if a preacher is a person who takes a message out to the people about living righteously, how can you do that by just building a boat? And you'd have to do more than that to take a message of righteousness out. So it seems sensible that Noah is doing more than that. But again, we don't know exactly how he was preaching or even why Peter calls him a preacher of righteousness. But he does. And so the act of just building this, now they would have thought of it as a weird shaped house. They didn't have an understanding of a boat then. As far as we know, they didn't do any boating. And so they wouldn't have just thought of this as being the weirdest shaped house that they'd ever seen. And just building a house like that doesn't say anything about how people should live. So you'd have to expect that Noah was preaching in words in some way and preaching salvation to them. And so we know that salvation doesn't come from living righteously. It comes from faith. And so Noah would have been preaching a repentance and a return to faith in God. And so his sermon might have been something like, God has seen the evil you do and decided to destroy all life, and he's commanded me to build this floating house thing here, and so we can survive, and if you repent and you return to God, you will be saved with us on board of this boat. So that was probably similar to his message, but we don't see that message being given anywhere in Genesis.
It should be 2 Peter.
Oh, did I mess that up? 2 Peter? Thank you. Okay, I'll change that later on. Okay, and this brings up that same question we were talking about a bit earlier, is how does anyone at that time know what is righteousness and what is evil? How would they know what a righteous life is? And they don't have a Bible like we do. They don't have anything written like we have. So how do they know this? Are they just going by their conscience, what God has written on their conscience as being righteous or not? And so that's all part of that question of how did the people back then know what we know that they knew about righteousness and what was wrong and what God wanted of them. But somehow they knew it. So it's kind of an open question that we don't have an answer to. But we know that Noah would have been preaching to them in some fashion about repenting, and they would have had to have understood what it means to repent, and they would have had to have accepted that as truth to have been saved. Now we know that none of them did do that. It was only Noah and his family that were preserved on the boat. But in our time, we don't even think about that much because we each have our own Bible, and we kind of expect that they might have had something like that. But as far as we know, they didn't have anything like that was written down that would show them what is righteousness and what isn't, what God wanted. Now, another thing that most people don't know and don't see in there is what's called Noahide law. And this is a law that God gives to Noah as he steps off the ark. And so God begins giving him a series of laws. And the Jews have lined all these up into 7 laws, and they're listed as I've done here. But you don't find them just all in one place. They're not like the 10 Commandments where all 10 of them are listed in a row. Well, you'll see them here and there and kind of spread all over the place. And some of them, there isn't even a specific verse that you would track it back to. But the Jews themselves have said, yes, there are these 7 laws that were given. And even in the New Testament, we'll see a reference to that that is a hint back to that same idea that there were these 7 laws that were originally given to mankind as Noah got off the boat. And these were the laws that God wanted them. And so this is really the first law that we've ever seen given to them. Before that time, the only law that they ever had was don't eat from that tree. And now they can't even get to that tree because they're kept out of the garden. So this is the first law that comes to mankind. And it's similar to the 10 Commandments in ways, and I've kind of linked that up here. And so they're traditionally listed this way. One is do not deny God or do not worship idols, same kind of idea. And that's very much like the first commandment. And then do not blaspheme or curse the name of God, and that's kind of like the 3rd commandment. And do not murder, that one's actually listed in Genesis 9, 5, 6. And that one is the 6th commandment. Do not engage in illicit sexual relations or adultery. That's like the 7th commandment. Do not steal, that is the 8th commandment. Do not eat from a live animal, that's eating blood is what's being referred to there. Different translations render that different ways. But in Genesis 9:4 you can see that. And so that's very much like the food laws that were part of the laws that the Jews observed. So we see that there's similar things there, but it's kind of like a little subset of that. And the very last one was kind of an odd one. It's established courts and a legal system to ensure obedience of the law. So God said to the people here, here's the laws, you establish courts, and you are to make sure that people obey these laws.
I was watching a recent video where they're saying that in Russia, they put blood in candies. And they sell them like that, and they said that they're very nutritious and all of that. And it's not human blood, but it's still blood. You know, it's blood from an animal, whatever. And that's contrary to the law too, but I don't think they care anything about the Bible or God.
Yeah, I think that most Protestants now don't know that they're not supposed to eat blood. That seems to have been something kind of lost on them. But on a separate comment, not related to that, the Scottish have a food called haggis, which has blood mixed into it. And it's some traditional dish of yours that most normal people could find offensive and wouldn't eat anyway. But, and that's, there are examples of foods around that do have blood in them, and we need to be careful about that.
Yeah, there's some people who will eat a steak that is very rare, and it's bloody steak too.
Well, if the food is butchered properly, then it should be okay. But you never know how it's been butchered, of course. Okay, continuing on with Noahide law and these laws. So as I said before, the Jewish sages have understood for a long time ago that these laws were given. But most Christians, most Protestants have no idea that these laws ever existed. And because they don't have that understanding of these laws, they kind of miss something that happens in Acts 15. And we'll take a little bit of a look at that. Because Acts 15 was that original law for all of mankind. It was the law that preceded the Mosaic law for the Jews. And so these laws were all given to Noah and given to him, not just for him, but for all of mankind as well. And as we saw before, it combines these laws about the relationship we should have with God and the laws about relationships with mankind, and also that bit of food law that's in there. And so you can think of that as kind of a subset of the 10 Commandments and the food law that was part of the Mosaic law. So it was kind of a predecessor to that. But it was a law that was for all of mankind, and the Mosaic law was not for all of mankind unless they chose to join with the Jews. It was the Mosaic law was for the Jews and those who joined with them. So continuing on with that, and the Acts reference to this. The New Testament has a reference to these Noahide laws, but it doesn't call them Noahide laws. That's a word that we've made up. And what happens back then, this comes from Acts 15, is Jewish converts were insisting that Gentile converts should be circumcised and should follow all the laws of Moses. And so that became a big row in the early church, and they tried to sort that out. And so all of the apostles and the leaders of the religious community were summoned to a council. And the council debated that. That's all covered in Acts 15. And the decision from the council is, as read here from Acts 15, it was the will of the Spirit of holiness and also of us that we would not put upon you a burden greater than those things which are necessary. Abstain from what is sacrificed, from blood, from what is strangled, and from fornication. And it continues on a little bit from there. And so if you understand that there was this Noahide law, you can see that this is actually a reference to that. He's saying this is the minimum set of laws for Christians to observe. And later on in Acts, it talks about as you grow and become more involved in the faith, you can do better than that. But if you're a person who doesn't understand this looks like the oddest subset of Jewish laws that would be listed here. Why would you only list these few things? But it makes sense when you think about this being those Noahide laws. And so we saw that what is sacrificed, you're supposed to stay away from that, from blood, from sacrifice to other gods, I should say there. We're supposed to stay away from what is strangled and stay away from fornication, of course. So that Noahide law does make sense even in Christianity, but very few Christians are aware of that. So what Acts says there makes sense. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense but it only makes sense if you understand that he's a reference back to the Noahide laws. And the Jews understood that, although, as I said, we don't. And so the council is saying that the laws that God gave to Noah are still the minimum standard for mankind. And this also helps us understand the covenant that God set up with Israel. I won't go into that of any detail. So out of all mankind, God chose a people to be closer to him than any other people and to be a light to the world. So originally mankind, after Noah, was given these Noahide laws, but then God chose a people out of that people who would be his people, and to them he gave the Mosaic laws. And they live to a higher standard that way. And as part of that, God made himself their king, and he called them to live to that higher standard.
You set up there, I think, on the second bullet, it says the council meaning what?
The Council of Acts 15, all of the people got together to discuss this problem that they were having, where the Jews, the former Jews who had become Christians were saying that all of the Christians should be observing all of the Jewish law and being circumcised. And so that's that council. It's called the First Council of Jerusalem in our terms. It's not called that in the Bible, of course. Okay, one more slide on this and we'll move to a new topic. Actually, I've covered a lot of this already. So there was a period of time there during the Mosaic Law where there were two laws in effect. There was one for God's chosen people, and that was Moses' law, Mosaic Law. And there was another one for all of the other peoples, the Gentiles, and that was the Noahide law. And so this caused a separation between the two, and we see references to that as well in the Bible. And so when the Jews killed Jesus, who was the promise of that old covenant, that covenant was destroyed. And a couple of places in the Bible it talks about a wall of separation between Jew and Gentile came down. And that's this wall that was created by having two different laws. And so I'll read from Ephesians on that one. He says, "But now you are in Yeshua the Messiah, when from the first you were distant, and you have come near by the blood of the Messiah. For he is our peace, who made the two one, and he destroyed the wall that was standing in the middle. And he has canceled the hatred by his flesh, and the law of commands in his commandments, that for the two he would create in his person one new man, and he has made peace." So summarizing that, he says that there was a wall that was created between these, and there was a separation between these people. The Jews weren't to be hanging around with Gentiles, and so all of these Mosaic laws were separating the people from the Gentiles, and he's saying that wall has been torn down now and doesn't exist anymore. And Acts 15 actually deals with a lot of that and the consequences of that. So there was this wall of separation between Jew and Gentile, but that's been destroyed now, and there's only one new man, neither Jew nor Gentile. Clean and unclean food is another interesting topic you probably didn't notice in Noah, the story of Noah. And so Noah, when he's told to take animals on board the ark, he's supposed to take a certain number of clean animals and a certain number of unclean animals. And so we see this first reference that in the Bible comes with Noah, and that's the first time we hear about unclean and clean foods. And remember that before that, the flood, the people only ate plants, or at least that's all they were supposed to be eating. That's all God said they should be eating. And I don't know if they could have even digested meat, but in any case, it was not until after the flood that God allowed man to eat animals. So that leaves us with kind of an odd question here. Noah seems to know what is clean and unclean, but it's not unclean or clean to him because he doesn't eat meat at all. He just eats greenery, vegetables. And so he's told to bring a certain number of clean types of animals, species of animals, aboard the ark, and a certain number of unclean types of animals. And so that kind of brings us to that same question we've had all along, is how does he know which ones are clean and which ones are unclean? Well, we don't know that, but this is all part of that big package of us seeing that those people of that time had some understanding of all of these things.
Right.
Mhm.
Answer a little. I think Noah, and if we read on a little bit ahead when God was going to give the commandments
Mhm.
to the Israelites,
The Ten Commandments?
yeah,
Mhm.
kind of see that God's intention was not to give us laws, written laws. His intention was for us to have those laws into our heart.
Yes.
So we see that he had already a relationship with Noah. He understood everything. Noah, in my way of view, I think he had a relationship with the Most High.
Yeah.
So he knew already what was clean and unclean.
But how did he know? Did the other people of that time know?
I don't think the other ones, because you're only gonna know if you have a relationship with God. I think Noah had already a relationship with Him. That's why he knew what was clean and not and was clean.
Because we see that with lots of other people. We see that even with the sons of Adam and Eve, is that they have an understanding of sacrifices. And where did they get that from? And we see that with Abraham. Where did Abraham get his understanding from?
I think it was about
Just
relationship.
that relationship?
In that time.
And they understood because of that?
Yeah. Because we don't see any reading law writing.
No.
During before the Ten Commandments, there was nothing.
Yeah, that's right.
But Noah knew Abraham, and we see that it was like a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it was through that relationship. We know there's a lot of people, it even goes back to Lot and a whole bunch of other people who had an understanding that you wonder where it came from, but maybe it did just come from a relationship.
It looks like they were keeping the Sabbath as well, even before the Ten Commandments were given in Exodus. Yet we don't hear anybody saying, honor the seventh day and all of that. But maybe it's like Elvin is saying, maybe it has to do with the relationship with God, that He guides them in that direction. So
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't formal.
Yeah, it wasn't formal. Certainly what the Bible doesn't record anything about a formal law being given about these things. But there are a large number of people who do understand at least part of it.
Could you say that it was ingrained in them?
Well, see, that's another approach to take is this coming from the conscience of men? If we had nothing else, would we from our conscience understand God well enough that we would do these things and know these things? I don't know. It's one of those questions we don't have a good answer to. Nothing in the Bible says that. But it makes you wonder. Okay, so I've already kind of spoken some of this stuff. So if mankind couldn't eat any animals, why were there animals that were clean and some that were unclean? And if they weren't being eaten by people at all, what's the difference to people whether they're clean or unclean? And most Christians don't understand this because their experience of clean and unclean comes from only the Old Covenant with Moses, and they don't understand more about that. And so they see clean and unclean as being just some rules that were given to the Israelites by God, and it was kind of an arbitrarily chosen list of animals that they couldn't eat. And that's not really the case there. And so by the time of the flood, or even earlier than that, some animals were considered unclean, and not as people food, but as God's food. They were unclean for sacrifice to God. And that's, that sacrifice to God is also described in the Bible as being God's food. And so even though it didn't matter to mankind whether an animal was clean or unclean, it mattered to God for sacrifices. And so they weren't, and they knew that they weren't supposed to be sacrificing certain animals to God.
I think we could also question what God's intention was. Although he doesn't really tell you why he wants you to do things and not other things. But I think he had good intentions from it, and I think, and we really don't ask that much about it because, we have to live by faith and obedience. But now what we know about blood, we know that it has a lot of bacteria in it, could make you sick. He also says not to eat anything that you find strangled or dead, because it may be rotting away. It might make you sick, So I know that, a lot of people that eat pork, for example, get trichinosis, or little bitty worms inside them. And even when they do an autopsy later on, they can find it in their brains and their lungs, everywhere else. So, but God never tried to explain those things.
Yeah.
He just simply said, don't do this and do that. Because if we start questioning God about everything, why do you ask me that? Then I think he wants you to trust him.
Yes.
And to live by faith.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. And that is a big part of that is walking by faith. And so unclean food was something that he doesn't, like you said, he doesn't say, I don't know why a pig is unclean and a cow isn't. That we can't see anything.
Hey, Stan?
Yeah.
Can I say something too about that?
Sure.
So I'm thinking, and this is just, because I've obviously been thinking about clean and unclean foods and stuff, and I think that we forget that God is also a God that made, science and math.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my thinking, he, all these unclean animals, which were never meant for food for us, they came into the picture because they have a purpose here. Like the bottom feeder fish, they're obviously what they are bottom feeders. They're supposed to clean up the oceans. They're supposed to eat up all the bad stuff so that our oceans and our freshwater systems stay clean, and pure. And so I think that was the original intent for these unclean birds and fish and other stuff. They clean up the mess, but that's their purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying, and that's similar to what Pastor Joe was saying, is that some of these foods we know now, because of the science that we have, we know that they're a dangerous food to eat, because like bottom feeders and pigs and other things like that. And so we understand now, because we have some technology and science, that there were those risks associated with it. And God didn't explain that. And we can't say for sure that that's all of God's purpose. Was he just protecting us against these dangerous animals, or is there even more to it than that? Because remember that they were unclean to God, and obviously any diseases or whatever they might have been carrying wouldn't have been affected in a sacrifice to God. So for us, yeah, there's certainly that element that it looks very often like he's protecting us against animals that would have dangers associated with them. Same with shellfish. Shellfish can pick up a number of ocean diseases and become dangerous at times too. So
they were also saying, like in Maine, where they're always, farming to get those clams and things, because they're famous for that, for clam chowder and lobsters and like that. They said the waters around that area are very filthy because there's not enough clams or lobster to clean up the mess.
okay, yeah. And so they do have that purpose.
Just like a vulture.
Mm-hmm.
I think the vulture's mentioned in the Bible.
carcasses.
That's dead.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's all interesting to see, I think. So, and yeah, I already brought up the idea of how did Noah know these things. And so when they leave the ark, Noah sacrifices one of every clean animal, but none of the unclean animals are sacrificed. And so we understand clean and unclean a little bit as God's definition of what was unclean and clean to him. And then that appears for mankind. The clean and unclean foods become that part of the old covenant. And so there's a number of things that we see here that are interesting that we're not going to have answers to. So just prepare yourself for that. Okay, another thing, changing to talking about the ark. We got lots of time here. Okay, so most Bibles say that God instructed Noah to make a window for the ark, and that's not really a good translation of what's in Genesis. Going from an interlinear, this is what Genesis 6:16 says. It says, "A noon shall you make in the ark, and to a cubit you shall finish it from above." Now the word noon is the Hebrew word that is actually there. And the translators are translating that one of two ways. They're either saying that is referring to a window or it's referring to a roof. But in no other place in the Bible does that word mean window or roof. The word always refers to something, the sun at midday or noontime. And so it's really only kind of talking about the heat of the sun at noontime when it's used in the Bible. So it really only ever means noon. And so you're left with this very odd phrase from Genesis 16 where God says, "You shall make a noon in the ark." And so people are wondering, well, what does that exactly mean? From the NIV, they translate that into roof. And so they say, make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. So that's God giving the rough outline of what the ark is to look like. And so, as I said before, this idea of a window or a roof, you'll see in different translations, and it's coming from this word noon. And so some think window is a better word because the meaning is that it's supposed to let in sun, like a noonday sun coming into the ark. But it's important to understand what life on the ark was like, and we don't ever think about that. It would have had very little light coming into it. The ark that they've made in Kentucky, remember that one? If you look at the pictures of that, I haven't been there yet, but that's on my bucket list. And so when you go in that full-size, full-scale ark, is you'll find they've got all sorts of lights inside to start to lighten the place, because if you build it the way Noah was to build it, there's not enough light to come in to really have an enjoyable life. And so the light that is coming in through this thing that God said should be built for it wouldn't have been enough, and that's not its main purpose. Its main purpose would have been to let out all of the fumes and nasty stuff from the animals that are in there, and so it didn't kill you from that, and so you would get some air circulation going too. So life on the ark wouldn't have been all that pleasant, because it would have been kind of a smelly business, and a lot of the time it would have been dark and not well lit. So we don't think of that sometimes, what that life would be like. As far as we know, they didn't have glass windows then, and so this thing wasn't a skylight, but some people like to think of it being a skylight. But a skylight would have been a dangerous thing to have, even if you could make glass, because if a hailstone comes down and breaks down your skylight, then the boat is going to fill up with water, and that's not a good thing. And so what we see in the full description that doesn't match with using a window is talks about this 1 cubit description, and the NIV renders that as leave an opening 1 cubit high all around below the roof. And so I drew up a picture here. I wonder if that's the next slide. Yes, it is. Can you see my pointer if I use it? No, you can't. Okay, so the part that's at the top. Oh, I know. Today is the day we have the laser
I was
pointer.
looking at that. I was going to use that one.
I think. Let me turn it on. That would help. Okay. Now the TV's too bright. Oh, you can't see that well enough. Okay, it was a good idea. In any case, I'll point with my finger. For those online, you won't be able to see. No, I should be able to get a pointer going here. Let me look at this.
Gotta think on the
Oh,
fly.
there you go.
Yeah, there we are. Okay. So this is the way NIV renders it, and this is their version, but I think it's pretty well thought out. The ones that use window, I don't find them having an ability to explain that 1 cubit thing that's talked about there. So I've drawn this as a flat roof, and that's probably what it was, but it might have been sloped, who knows. There isn't any mention of that. It would have been a framework of wood covered by animal skins, because that's what they had. They didn't have a lot of the kind of tarps that we have. So they would have used animal skins almost certainly for that. And we'll see a verse that actually talks about that later on. So, and then below that, so supporting that, there would have been a huge beam, probably a round tree, supporting that roof. And then there's this 1 cubit gap here, and this would have been for the air to come in and circulate through, and for the new air to come in and the old smelly stuff to go out. And then it would be finished, as NIV says, up to that point, so there would be that 1 gap. And so that's the way NIV is describing it, and that seems like a pretty fair description to me.
But how much would be a cubit?
Cubit is 18 inches. Well, actually, that's the normal cubit, the short cubit. There's also a long cubit that's about 2 inches and a little bit more longer than that. But most times it's the short cubit that's used, so 18 inches roughly. And so the idea is that this roof covering would have covered probably all of, or most of, the top of the boat, and so there would have been this 1 cubit gap all the way around to let air out and air in, and some sunlight in, but still not nearly enough.
Makes sense.
Okay, so that's not the last time we hear about a window with Noah. And so in Genesis 8:6, Noah opens the window, but the word that gets used here in the Hebrew is a completely different word. It's not that same noon word. And so in 8:6 it says, after 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark. And so the word that gets used here is the normal window word. It means a piercing through the wall, it's a hole in the wall, that kind of an idea. And remember that at that time, almost certainly their windows were nothing more fancy than that. No glass, just holes in walls. And so, this window that he's opening up doesn't seem to be something that God has specified. And perhaps it's something that he added later, or maybe added right at the time. And so we get into something I mentioned a bit last time. The Jews have talked about themselves, and they've seen this kind of oddity here about this window and what's going on there. We'll talk about that a little bit more about this window and what's going on with Noah about this opening that he's created. So that's not the last reference to the window. Later on, just the boat has now come to land on land, and it's sitting there and been there for 40 days and more than that now. And so Noah, in Genesis 8:13, says, Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. And so this is from NIV again, and this lines up with their idea of that roof being kind of a wood frame covered by animal skins. And what they do is they roll back all the animal skins, and that would allow more light into the people down there so that they could see better, and also more air to flow through. And we also note there that once they do that, then it's possible for Noah to see the ground for himself. Until that time, he hasn't been able to see the ground. And so he's been sending out these birds to go and be his spies or whatever to see the world out there. And so it's not until they remove this covering off the ark that Noah gets a chance to see the ground for himself. Okay, some struggles here. And this goes back to that window opening, and we'll talk about that and some other things. Noah changes while on the ark. And we see that in a couple ways that the Bible describes. And one of the indications is this opening of the ark's window. And this is something I pulled from a Jewish site, and the Jews have all recognized this idea of why is he doing this? God didn't say, hey, Noah, make a window, and then you can send some birds out. He's doing this entirely on his own initiative. And so the Jews have wondered, as other people have wondered in Christianity too, what exactly is Noah doing here? Because when you mix it together with a number of other things, it looks like Noah is having some kind of a psychological struggle that he's working with. And so the idea there is that they think that he may have cut this window while the ship was floating still, and because he was getting impatient and was tired of being in this stinky old boat with not much light. And so we don't see God talk with Noah anytime after he closes the door. Remember, it was God who closed the door, and from that point on until God says, okay, get off the earth, off the ark, we don't see any reference to God speaking with Noah. And so the Jews, as well as other people, have wondered if Noah is becoming impatient here. And so he's now acting like a man who doesn't really trust God anymore. He's taking things into his own hands. And so he feels a need to protect himself and his family and everything that he feels he's in charge of here. And so just about the time he starts doing these things, then God shows up and says, okay, it's time to leave the ark. You can go now. And it probably wasn't even possible for him to open the main door because God was the one who had closed that. So I kind of expect it would have to have been God that opened that door. So that's one indication that he is having some struggles. The next one comes after he's been on shore for a while. And that's that he gets drunk, takes his clothes off, and passes out in his tent. And so in our time, getting drunk is an indication that a person has some struggles, some unresolved issues that he's working with and not doing a good job of working through. And we see that in a lot of people who are drinking to forget things, or they're drinking because they're unhappy about something. And so the Jews as well have seen this as part of a pattern there. And so what we do see happen there is his son Ham wanders into Noah's tent and sees him laying there naked and mocks him and goes to his brothers and tells them about that. And they deal with it better than Ham did. But this seems to be an indication of a pattern also in that they were aware that Noah was having these struggles. And so they sort of saw, they weren't surprised that he was drunk and laying in his tent. What they did instead was they covered him properly. And so they may have been aware that Noah was struggling as well. So that's another indication here. And the result of all that is that Noah curses Ham for what he's done here. And so another indication here is that prior to building the ark, God refers to Noah as a righteous man, one of the few righteous men on the earth. And then after the ark, God refers to Noah again, but now he refers to him as a man of the earth. And so that seems also, people say, to indicate that there's been a change in Noah. He's struggling with this. And we talked about all the people that Noah would have known before who are now dead people. And so maybe those kind of things are causing him some trouble. Maybe it's kind of like a PTSD thing he's going through. It might be something like that he's struggling with.
You know, there is also a term that they use for people that act foolishly, is that they ham it up. You know, they're a big ham. So I don't know.
Is that where that came from?
Maybe that's where it comes from.
Maybe. I'm going to see if I can look that up.
Or the ham itself making pork.
Yeah, it makes more sense the way you say ham, because I don't see ham being all that funny. Okay, so you probably didn't notice that or think about that before, and that's our goal here, is to look at some things you've never thought of. So now we'll jump to the New Testament a little bit. We did one reference from the New Testament. We'll do some more here, and so. How did the flood remove the curse that had been put on the ground? Well, the ground was ripped up. We talked about that before. And that was enough to remove the curse. But in the Bible, this is talked about as being a baptism of sorts. And so like any baptism, it's a purification, and evil and curses are washed away. So in a couple ways, we see the flood being a baptism in that it washes away that curse that was on the land. And we're going to see it also used in another way, and so we'll move on to that. So Peter talks about that, and he refers to the flood as a type of baptism as well for people in this case. And so, his actual point is to talk about Jesus descending into Sheol, but he's talking about the people who are down there, the pre-Noah people. So I'll read that whole passage from 1 Peter 3. Hopefully I got the reference right. And he preached to those souls who were held in Sheol, these who from the first were not convinced, in the days of Noah, when the long-suffering of God commanded that there would be an ark, upon the hope of their repentance. And only 8 souls entered it, and were kept alive by water. For you also are alive in it, by that simile in baptism, not when you wash the body from impurity, but when you confess God with a pure conscience, and by the resurrection of Yeshua, the Messiah. So, Paraphrasing this, he's talking about the pre-Noah people that Jesus ministered to in Sheol after he had died. And he says these people were kept alive in the ark by water. And he says, you are also, you people that he's speaking to in his epistle, you also are alive by water through a simile, which is baptism. So he's saying that baptism is very much like that. But he uses this phrase in a way that we wouldn't normally think of. He talks about this, he credits the water with saving Noah. And we actually think of the ark as having saved Noah from the water. And so he kind of has a different perspective on that. So that's interesting that way to think of it. We think of the ark saving him from the water. Okay, and Noah also gets a second coming reference in the New Testament. And Jesus uses this, the act of Noah and his family and the animals entering into the ark in an unexpected way, in a second coming way. And he uses that as an example of how things will be at the time of the second coming. And you probably remember this one. But about that day and about that hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but the Father alone. But just as the days of Noah, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For just as they were eating and drinking before the flood, and they were taking wives and they were taking husbands, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not perceive until the flood came and took them all away, thus will be the coming of the Son of Man. So his point here is that when the second coming happens, people will be just like they were in Noah's time. There'll be a whole bunch of people who are just living their lives. There's nothing wrong with taking wives or taking husbands or all that sort of thing, but that's the focus of their lives, and nothing more than that. They have no God in their focus. And so that's the point that Jesus is making, is that the world at the time when he comes back will be just like that. There'll be very few people who are believers anymore. It'll be just people going on, living their lives, doing the things that make people happy, unaware of what's about to happen. So he's saying to those people, it's going to be a big shock to them. Now, that's not the only parallel between Noah and the second coming. I mentioned before the verse from Genesis 6 that says that God closed the door of the ark. It wasn't Noah who did that. He didn't have some ropes or something that he pulled up so that the door closed. And so from Genesis 7:16, it says, those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. And some people read that even more than that. He may have closed more than just the ark. He may have closed up any gaps or leaks that might have been in the walls and made sure that it was seaworthy. And so what you see there, that idea that God closed the ark, it reappears again in a similar idea in Matthew 25:10. And this is from a parable that Jesus is telling. He says, the groom came, and those who were ready entered with him into the wedding place, and the door was barred. So you see that same idea represented there, that time has passed. And this is when Jesus comes back, and there will be a time when the door is barred, just as it was, just as the door was closed in the ark. And at that time, all of those who aren't part of Jesus' people won't have an option to change at that time. So this goes back to what we said earlier, that the world will be as evil at the second coming as it was in Noah's time. And that doesn't mean it isn't that evil now. It could be that evil now, but God is just waiting for the right time for all the different things to line up that have been prophesied. And so, but we do see that God's solution will be different. His solution with Noah and the ark was that he was going to destroy all of the people that way. His solution when he comes back is going to be quite different. He's going to become the king of everything and take over that and insist that people worship him and obey him. Okay, reality of Noah. Was Noah real is a question that a lot of people ask, even within Christian churches. And there are many Christians that have been influenced in the world, and they don't believe that Noah was a real person. And so that whole idea they think is, well, no, it's just a story to tell us some greater truths, and it wasn't really true that it ever happened. And we don't accept that, of course. And so in these various verses that I've talked about that are New Testament verses that refer back to Noah, you can see that both Jesus and Peter refer to Noah and the flood as a real person and a real event, and not just a symbolic story. And so you can see from that neither of those people believe that it was just a symbolic story They see it as real people.
I know the Catholic Church doesn't believe that all those stories are real.
Really?
I guess if we get Cynthia to comment on that sometime, they don't believe that the Ark story was real, about the flood, the parting of the Red Sea, and on and on. They don't believe any of those things are real. They're just fables that they use to entertain the kids with, but they're not really true. But that is what the Catholic Church says.
I'm surprised at that. Okay, so summarizing what we've been through here quickly, and then we're done. So we heard about Noah's name, and that his name was rest, and that there was a prophecy about him that he would bring rest to people because of to give them rest from the hardship of the curse that God had put on the ground. And we saw that, yes, indeed, the curse was removed from the ground, but probably not the way that people were expecting. We looked at the window and that whole idea that the purpose of the window was to let in some light and let air in and out so that people wouldn't die from bad air. We also looked at the Noahide law, spent quite a bit of time on that, because it also comes back in the New Testament as something that's referred to there. We also saw that ideas that Noah struggled there. He was having some sort of a problem and wasn't adapting well to either his loss or the new world that he was living in. We don't know exactly what, but he seems to have become impatient and not waiting on God anymore. We also saw the idea of clean and unclean food in both pre-Noah times and we talked about Mosaic times as well. And we saw the flood as a baptism, which is kind of an interesting idea. We don't normally think of it that way, but there's two different ways to think of that. One is a baptism of the land for 40 days that purified the land, and the other one is a symbol of baptism for mankind. And we also saw that Noah and the second coming, we just saw those verses, and we talked about the idea that Noah was really real, a real person, and real events and things like that happened. Any last questions?
So if it isn't an actual window, what word would you use to describe it?
We don't have a good word for that I know. Yeah.
Or more like a vent.
Yeah, vent's not bad. Yeah. A vent isn't normally intended to let light in, and this was part of its purpose for that thing. But vent might be as close as we got.